Throughout history, empires have risen to unprecedented heights of power, wealth, and influence, only to crumble back into the dust of time. The Spanish Empire, the British Empire, the Soviet Union each followed a remarkably similar pattern of decline. And if history teaches us anything, it's that this pattern repeats with an almost mechanical precision. Today, we're going to examine the 7 stages of empire collapse, trace them through 3 historical examples, and then confront an uncomfortable truth. The United States appears to be at stage 5 of this inevitable cycle. This isn't political commentary or sensationalism. This is pattern recognition based on historical evidence. The question isn't whether empires fall. They always do. The question is, can we recognize where we are in the pattern, and does recognition change the outcome? Let's begin. Stage 1. The Golden Age of Expansion. Every empire begins with a period of explosive growth. This is the stage where everything seems possible, where military victories come easily, where wealth flows in from conquered territories or dominated trade routes, and where the empire's culture, values, and systems appear superior to all others. Spain, 1492 to 1580. After the Reconquista expelled the Moors from Iberia, Spain embarked on an age of exploration and conquest that would reshape the world. Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492 opened the floodgates. Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire. Francisco Pizarro toppled the Incas. Spanish conquistadors claimed vast territories across the Americas, and treasure ships laden with gold and silver sailed regularly from the New World to Seville. Under Charles V and Philip II, Spain became the world's first global empire, controlling territories on every inhabited continent. The Spanish language, Catholic faith, and European culture spread across 2 continents. This was Spain's golden age, an era of seemingly unlimited expansion and wealth. Britain, 1815 to 1914. Following victory in the Napoleonic Wars, Britain entered what would be called the Pax Britannica, a century of relative peace maintained by British naval supremacy. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain, gave the empire unprecedented technological and economic advantages. British ships dominated global trade routes. The empire expanded across Africa, solidified control over India, the jewel in the crown, and established dominance in Asia, the Pacific, and the Caribbean. By the late 19th century, the British Empire controlled approximately 1/4 of the world's land surface and 1/4 of its population. The sun, quite literally, never set on British territories. London was the financial capital of the world. The Royal Navy ruled the seas, and British culture, law, and language spread to every corner of the globe. Soviet Union, 1945 to 1960. The USSR emerged from World War II as one of 2 global superpowers, despite the devastating losses it had suffered. The Red Army had crushed Nazi Germany and occupied Eastern Europe. Over the next 15 years, the Soviet sphere of influence expanded dramatically. Communist governments, aligned with Moscow, took power in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. China fell to communist revolution in 1949. Soviet influence spread to Cuba, North Korea, and Vietnam. The USSR demonstrated technological prowess by launching Sputnik in 1957, shocking the West and winning the first round of the space race. Soviet economic growth rates in the 1950s were impressive, and the communist model seemed to offer a viable alternative to Western capitalism. This was the peak of Soviet expansion and confidence. United States, 1945 to 1991. America emerged from World War II as the world's unquestioned superpower. The Soviet Union was a military rival, but economically there was no comparison. The U.S. economy represented nearly half of global GDP in the immediate post-war years. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. American military bases circled the globe. American culture, movies, music, consumer brands became global phenomena. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe along American-influenced lines. NATO expanded American security guarantees across the democratic world. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the United States stood alone as the sole superpower, the unipolar moment. This was America's undisputed golden age, a period of expansion, optimism, and global dominance that seemed unshakable. Stage 2. Overextension and financial strain. Success breeds ambition, and ambition breeds overreach. In Stage 2, the empire is still powerful, still expanding, but the costs begin to outweigh the benefits. Military commitments multiply. The bureaucracy swells. Maintaining the empire becomes increasingly expensive, and the financial strain begins to show. Spain, 1580 to 1640. Despite the wealth flowing from the Americas, Spain's expenses spiraled out of control. Philip II fought wars on multiple fronts against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, against England, including the disastrous Spanish Armada in 1588, against Ottoman Turks in the Mediterranean, and in support of Catholic forces across Europe. The empire maintained garrisons and fleets across 4 continents. The costs were staggering. Spain declared bankruptcy in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, defaulting on loans from Italian and German bankers who financed the empire's wars. The flow of silver from American mines actually accelerated inflation rather than creating sustainable wealth, a phenomenon that baffled Spanish administrators. Resources were drained, maintaining far-flung territories that generated less revenue than they consumed. The empire was militarily overextended and financially hollow. Britain, 1914 to 1945. The 2 world wars shattered Britain financially. World War I cost Britain a quarter of its national wealth. The empire had reached maximum territorial extent after World War I, absorbing former German and Ottoman territories, but these acquisitions were more burden than benefit. Britain borrowed heavily from the United States to finance both wars. After World War II, Britain owed massive debts and could no longer afford to maintain its global military presence. Independence movements stirred across the empire. The economic model that had sustained British power, industrial dominance, and colonial extraction no longer worked in a changed world. Britain was overextended militarily, exhausted economically, and increasingly unable to hold together an empire that spanned the globe. Soviet Union, 1960 to 1985. The USSR's commitments grew steadily while its economy stagnated. The arms race with the United States consumed an estimated 15 to 20% of Soviet GDP, an unsustainable burden. The USSR maintained satellite states in Eastern Europe that required subsidies. It supported communist movements and governments in Cuba, Vietnam, Angola, Ethiopia, and Afghanistan. The invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 became the Soviet Vietnam, a costly quagmire that drained resources and morale. Meanwhile, the Soviet economy failed to keep pace with the West. Central planning proved inefficient. Technological innovation lagged. Consumer goods were shoddy and scarce. The USSR was spending itself into oblivion trying to match American military might while its economic foundation crumbled. United States 1991 present. After the Cold War, the United States expanded its commitments rather than consolidating. NATO expanded eastward toward Russia's borders. The War on Terror, beginning in 2001, led to 2 decades of conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and elsewhere. The U.S. maintains approximately 750 military bases in 80 countries, far more than any other nation. The costs have been staggering. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone cost over $8 trillion, according to Brown University's Costs of War project. The national debt has exploded from $5.6 trillion in 2000 to over $36 trillion today. Military spending consumes over $800 billion annually, more than the next 10 countries combined. Yet despite this spending, recent withdrawals from Afghanistan and reduced engagement in the Middle East suggest an inability to maintain commitments. The empire is overextended, and the financial strain is undeniable. Stage 3. Internal decay and social fracture. As external costs mount, internal cohesion breaks down. The social contract that bound the empire together during its rise begins to fray. Inequality increases. Different regions or groups within the empire begin to see their interests as separate rather than unified. Political dysfunction increases. The faith in institutions that held society together erodes. Spain, 1640 to 1700. The Spanish Empire began to splinter from within. In 1640, both Portugal and Catalonia revolted against Spanish rule. Portugal successfully regained independence after 60 years of Spanish control. The Dutch Republic finally secured independence after 80 years of warfare. In Spain itself, different kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, Catalonia, increasingly saw themselves as having separate interests. The Spanish court became infamous for corruption and incompetence. The Habsburg dynasty, weakened by generations of inbreeding, produced increasingly ineffective monarchs. Charles II, who ruled from 1665 to 1700, was physically and mentally disabled, unable to produce an heir, and largely incapable of governing. Spanish society became increasingly rigid and backward-looking, clinging to Catholic orthodoxy, while the rest of Europe embraced scientific revolution and religious pluralism. The expulsion of Jews and later Moriscos had drained Spain of skilled professionals and entrepreneurs. What was once a dynamic empire became a sclerotic society, divided and declining. Britain, 1945 to 1970. Post-war Britain experienced profound social change and internal division. The class system that had defined British society for centuries came under attack. The wartime consensus around shared sacrifice dissolved into class conflict. The Labour government elected in 1945 implemented major socialist reforms, nationalizing industries and creating the National Health Service that conservative forces opposed. Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland developed stronger regional identities, and the troubles in Northern Ireland erupted into decades of violence. Colonial subjects who had fought for Britain during the war demanded independence, fragmenting the empire. Within Britain itself, economic decline led to the winter of discontent in the late 1970s, with widespread strikes paralyzing the country. The social cohesion that had sustained Britain through 2 world wars was breaking down. Britain was becoming a deeply divided society, uncertain of its identity and direction. Soviet Union, 1985 to 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were attempts to save the Soviet system, but they instead exposed how hollow it had become. Once people could speak freely, they revealed how deeply they resented the system. The different republics within the USSR, Ukraine, the Baltic states, the Caucasus, Central Asia began asserting nationalist identities suppressed for decades. The Communist Party's monopoly on truth and power evaporated. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986 shattered remaining faith in Soviet competence. The withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989 was a humiliating defeat. Eastern European satellite states broke free in rapid succession during 1989–1990. Within the USSR itself, food shortages, economic chaos, and ethnic violence became common. The Soviet Union didn't fall to external enemies, it collapsed from internal contradictions that could no longer be contained or papered over. The empire dissolved because its constituent parts no longer wished to be part of it. United States present. American society is experiencing profound polarization and social fracture. Political divisions have intensified to levels not seen since the Civil War era. Red states and blue states increasingly see themselves as having incompatible values and interests. Trust in institutions, government, media, science, religion has plummeted across the political spectrum. Economic inequality has reached levels last seen in the Gilded Age, with wealth concentrated among a small elite while the middle class shrinks. The social mobility that once defined the American dream has stalled. Different ethnic and cultural groups increasingly organize around separate identities rather than a unifying national identity. Conspiracy theories flourish. Political violence has re-emerged. The peaceful transfer of power, long taken for granted, was challenged in 2021. The question increasingly being asked is not whether America will solve its problems, but whether America will hold together as a unified nation. The social fabric is tearing. Stage 4. Loss of economic dominance. Every empire's power ultimately rests on economic foundations. When economic dominance erodes, when other powers develop more efficient systems, more advanced technology, or simply outproduce, the empire decline accelerates. The empire can no longer afford its commitments, its currency loses status. Its industries become uncompetitive. Economic decline and imperial decline become mutually reinforcing. Spain, 1700 to 1800. The Spanish economy never recovered from its earlier crises. While Britain, the Netherlands, and later France embraced mercantilism, developed banking systems, and fostered manufacturing, Spain remained dependent on extracting wealth from its colonies rather than creating it through innovation and industry. The flow of silver from the Americas declined, and much of what did arrive went to pay off foreign debts. Spain failed to develop a significant merchant class or industrial base. Agricultural productivity remained low. The economy stagnated while competitors advanced. By the 18th century, Spain was an economic backwater in Western Europe, a second-rate power clinging to the remnants of a once great empire. The economic foundation that had supported Spanish power had crumbled. Britain, 1945 to 1980. British economic decline after World War II was stark and painful. Industries that had made Britain the workshop of the world, textiles, steel, shipbuilding, were no longer competitive with American, German, and Japanese producers. The empire that had been a source of wealth became a financial burden. India, which had been a profitable colony, became an independent nation requiring no British products. British currency lost its status. The pound sterling, once the world's reserve currency, was devalued multiple times. Britain went to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout in 1976, a humiliating moment for a nation that had once been the world spanker. British productivity lagged behind competitors. The phrase, "the sick man of Europe," was commonly applied to Britain. Economic decline forced Britain to give up its empire not by choice, but by necessity. It simply could unafford to maintain it. Soviet Union, 1985 to 1991. The Soviet economy, which had grown impressively in the 1950s, stagnated completely by the 1980s. Central planning proved incapable of managing a complex modern economy. The USSR fell further and further behind the West technologically. Consumer goods were scarce and poor quality. Agricultural productivity was so low that the USSR, despite vast farmland, had to import grain from the United States. The military-industrial complex consumed resources that should have gone to productive investment. Corruption was endemic. When oil prices fell in the 1980s, the USSR lost crucial hard currency earnings. The economy was collapsing even before the political system fell apart. The USSR didn't lose the Cold War primarily because of American military pressure. It lost because its economic system simply didn't work. United States present. American economic dominance, while still significant, is clearly eroding. China has become the world's largest economy by purchasing power parity and is on track to surpass the US in nominal GDP within the next decade. American manufacturing has been hollowed out, with supply chains dependent on foreign production. The US runs persistent trade deficits. Infrastructure is aging and inadequate compared to competitors. Educational performance has declined relative to other developed nations. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency, but this status is being challenged through arrangements like BRICS and bilateral trade agreements that bypass dollar systems. The national debt exceeds GDP and is growing faster than the economy. Meanwhile, China leads in key technologies like 5G, electric vehicles, and solar energy. The economic advantages that sustained American power for 75 years are diminishing. The US is still the largest economy, but the gap is closing, and in some sectors has already closed. Stage 5. Failure to adapt and reform. This is the critical stage, the point where an empire either reforms itself and potentially extends its life, or clings to outdated models and accelerates its decline. Stage 5 is characterized by recognition that the old ways aren't working, followed by either inadequate reforms or complete inability to implement necessary changes due to internal resistance, ideological rigidity, or institutional sclerosis. Spain, 1800 to 1898. Spain made several attempts at reform during the 19th century, but all failed to reverse the decline. Liberal reformers tried to modernize Spain's economy and political system, but faced fierce resistance from conservative forces, the monarchy, the church, and landed aristocracy. Spain oscillated between liberal and conservative governments, military coups, and even civil wars. The country could not establish stable, effective governance. Meanwhile, independence movements swept Spanish America. One by one, the colonies broke away: Mexico, Peru, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela. By the 1820s, Spain had lost almost all of its American empire. Spain tried to hold on to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, but in the Spanish-American War of 1898, the United States decisively defeated Spain and took these last colonial possessions. Spain was reduced to a minor European power, its empire gone. The failure to adapt to the modern world had completed Spain's transition from global empire to regional power. Britain, 1980 present. Britain eventually implemented painful but necessary reforms under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, shifting from a manufacturing to a service-based economy, particularly focused on finance. This extended Britain's relevance but at significant social cost and with long-term vulnerabilities. Britain adapted better than Spain but never regained its former preeminence. The loss of empire was managed relatively well, with most colonies granted independence peacefully, and many former colonies maintained ties through the Commonwealth. However, Britain's attempt to find a new role has been troubled. Brexit, the decision to leave the European Union, represented a choice between competing visions of Britain's post-imperial identity, and the process revealed deep divisions within British society. Britain has adapted enough to remain a prosperous nation, but not enough to remain a great power. It is a middle power with a glorious past, no longer shaping global events but shaped by them. Soviet Union. The USSR never reached stage 5 in the traditional sense. It never successfully implemented reforms because the reforms it attempted triggered total systemic collapse. Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika were designed to save Soviet communism by making it more flexible and efficient, but they instead revealed the system was unreformable. Once the mechanisms of totalitarian control loosened, everything fell apart. The USSR went directly from recognition that change was necessary to complete disintegration. This represents a failure to adapt so complete that the empire ceased to exist. It's a cautionary tale. Sometimes reforms come too late, and sometimes the system is so rigid that attempting to change it causes it to shatter entirely. United States present. This is where America finds itself now at stage 5, the critical juncture. The United States recognizes it faces serious challenges: unsustainable debt, infrastructure decay, political dysfunction, rising inequality, educational decline, and competitive pressure from China. There is widespread agreement that something must change. But there is no agreement on what should change or how. Political polarization makes comprehensive reform nearly impossible. Each political party, when in power, implements changes the other party immediately tries to reverse. Long-term planning is sacrificed for short-term political advantage. Special interests resist changes that would threaten their position. Ideological rigidity on both sides prevents pragmatic compromise. Attempts at infrastructure investment, immigration reform, entitlement reform, tax reform, and healthcare reform have all foundered on political gridlock. The system recognizes it needs to change, but appears incapable of implementing the necessary changes. America is stuck at stage 5, aware of the problems, unable to solve them, watching the window for effective action gradually close. Stage 6. Accelerated decline and territorial contraction. When reform fails, decline accelerates. The empire begins to visibly contract. Territories break away or are abandoned. Influence diminishes. Other powers fill the vacuum. What was once unthinkable, the empire losing its possessions, its status, its power, becomes reality. The psychological shock of this stage is profound, as the national identity has been built around the empire's greatness. Spain, 1898 to 1975. After losing its last major colonies in 1898, Spain descended into isolation and irrelevance. The country turned inward, and what followed was a period of instability, dictatorship, and civil war. The Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 was devastating, killing hundreds of thousands and leaving the country under Franco's fascist dictatorship for nearly 40 years. Spain sat out World War II and remained diplomatically and economically isolated for decades. The glorious Spanish Empire became a distant memory. Spain didn't regain democracy until Franco's death in 1975, and didn't rejoin the European mainstream until the 1980s. The territorial contraction from global empire to Iberian Peninsula was complete. Britain, 1945 to 1997. British imperial contraction happened relatively quickly. India gained independence in 1947, a devastating blow to British prestige and power. Over the next 30 years, Britain granted independence to dozens of colonies across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. The Suez Crisis of 1956 definitively demonstrated that Britain could no longer act as a great power without American approval. British military commitments worldwide were progressively abandoned. The transfer of Hong Kong to China in 1997 marked the symbolic end of the British Empire. The sun finally set on British territories. Britain contracted from ruling a quarter of the world to being one nation among many in Europe. The adjustment was painful and the psychological wound deep. Britain has struggled ever since to define what it is, now that it is no longer an empire. Soviet Union, 1989 to 1991. Soviet territorial contraction happened with breathtaking speed. The Eastern European satellite states broke free in 1989. The Berlin Wall fell. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. The various Soviet republics declared independence one after another throughout 1990 and 1991. Red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time on December 26, 1991. The USSR, which had been a superpower just a few years earlier, ceased to exist. It fragmented into 15 independent nations. Russia inherited most of the Soviet military and nuclear arsenal, but lost half the population and much of the economic base. The contraction from superpower to troubled regional power happened in less than 3 years, one of the fastest imperial collapses in history. United States future. The United States has not yet reached stage 6, but warning signs are visible. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 echoed Britain's Suez moment, a clear demonstration of limits to American power. The U.S. has reduced military commitments in the Middle East and is pivoting toward great power competition with China. But questions remain about whether America has the resources and will to maintain even these reduced commitments. NATO's cohesion is periodically questioned. American security guarantees are no longer taken for granted by allies. China's Belt and Road Initiative is extending Chinese influence while American influence recedes in many regions. The territorial contraction stage for America, should it come, might look different than for previous empires, less about losing colonies, and more about withdrawing from global military commitments, seeing alliances fray, watching the dollar lose reserve currency status, and accepting a multipolar world where America is one major power among several rather than the sole superpower. Whether America reaches stage 6 depends largely on whether it can navigate stage 5 successfully, and that remains an open question. Stage 7. Collapse or transformation. The final stage arrives when the empire either collapses entirely or transforms into something fundamentally different, usually a smaller, less powerful nation that retains in some residual influence based on its past glory but is no longer an empire in any meaningful sense. Spain. Modern Spain is a prosperous democratic European nation, but it is not and will never again be an empire. It is a middle power within the European Union, with significant cultural influence through language and shared history with Latin America, but no pretensions to great power status. The Spanish Empire collapsed, and modern Spain rose from its ashes. Different, smaller, but stable. The transformation took centuries and was painful, but Spain survived as a nation even as the empire died. Britain. Modern Britain is similarly a prosperous, democratic nation with significant soft power through language, culture, and historical ties. London remains a major financial center. Britain retains a permanent seat on the UN Security Council and nuclear weapons vestiges of great power status. But Britain is not an empire and increasingly not even a major power. Brexit may accelerate Britain's continued decline from middle power to small power. The British Empire collapsed, and Britain has spent 75 years trying to figure out what it is now that it is no longer an empire. The jury is still out on whether this transformation will be successful in the long term. Soviet Union, Russia. The USSR collapsed entirely. What emerged from the wreckage was Russia, a nation that inherited much of the Soviet military but lost half the population, much of the economic base, and most of the ideological appeal. Modern Russia is a regional power with nuclear weapons and energy resources, but it is not a superpower. It tries to project influence in its near abroad and occasionally further afield. But its economy is smaller than Italy's. The Soviet collapse was not managed, it simply happened, and the resulting transformation has been troubled. Russia remains in transition, trying to figure out its identity and role in a world where it is no longer a superpower, but refuses to accept being just another nation among many. United States. America has not yet reached stage 7. The United States is still the world's most powerful nation by most measures. But the trajectory is concerning. If America cannot successfully navigate stage 5, if it cannot implement necessary reforms and adaptations, then stage 6, and eventually stage 7 become inevitable. What would American stage 7 look like? Perhaps a scenario where the U.S. remains a large, prosperous nation but is clearly no longer the global hegemon. A world where China is the dominant economic power, where the dollar is no longer the unquestioned reserve currency, where American military power has contracted to defending core national interests rather than maintaining global order, where American culture and values no longer dominate globally. Or perhaps something more dramatic, a genuine crisis that forces rapid transformation or even fragmentation. The question is not whether America will eventually reach stage 7, all empires do, but when and what form that transformation will take. Conclusion: recognizing the pattern, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The pattern we've traced through Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union is not identical in each case, but it is remarkably similar. Golden age, overextension, internal decay, economic decline, failure to adapt, accelerated contraction, collapse, or transformation. Different timelines, different specific causes, but the same general pattern. And now we observe the United States at stage 5, the critical juncture, where empires either find a way to adapt and potentially extend their power or fail to change and accelerate toward decline. America faces a choice, though that choice is constrained by forces beyond any individual's or government's control. Does recognizing this pattern change anything? History suggests that empires rarely, if ever, recognize their own decline while it's happening. Those within the empire always believe their situation is different, that their power is justified by unique virtues, that their decline is temporary or can be reversed with the right leadership. The psychological inability to accept decline may itself be part of the pattern. Yet, there is something to be said for clear-eyed recognition. Spain did not see its decline coming until it had already happened. Britain saw it coming but couldn't stop it. The Soviet Union didn't see it coming at all. The collapse surprised even the experts. America has the advantage of historical perspective, of being able to see the pattern that previous empires could not. Whether that knowledge can be converted into effective action remains to be seen. The empires we've examined teach us that collapse is not usually a single dramatic event, but a process that unfolds over decades or even centuries. It's a series of choices, each one seeming reasonable in isolation, that collectively lead down a path from which return becomes increasingly difficult. It's debts that are never quite paid down. It's military commitments that are never quite reduced. It's internal divisions that are never quite healed. It's reforms that are always promised but never quite implemented. Until one day, what seemed impossible becomes inevitable. The 7 stages of empire collapse are not a prophecy but a pattern. Patterns can be broken, though history suggests this is rare. Whether America at stage 5 finds a way to reform, adapt, and break the pattern, or whether it follows Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union through stages 6 and 7, will be determined by choices made in the coming years and decades. The pattern is clear. The question is, what will we do with that knowledge?